Tim Butler is going to talk to us today about analysing your website performance. So Tim has 20 years of IT experience. He specialises in high-performance websites and scalable infrastructure. He's currently the Chief Security Architect at Kinetics Web Hosting, and he's also the author of the Engine X Cookbook, which I just learned. I'm a copywriter, not a website developer. It's not actually recipes. It's something to do with tech. So I'll hand you over now to Tim. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Obviously a little bit about me. So, sort of have 20 years experience, built and sort of worked with a lot of sort of high performance websites. My focus is mostly on the infrastructure side, but I also know the other side, I guess, of web development and the issues that sort of need to be resolved as well. Also a certified beer judge, so when people are looking for an icebreaker, certainly if you love to talk about beer, I absolutely love to talk about beer to the point where I have a certification in judging. Not quite. more study required. So a little bit about this talk. We're going to look at some of the numbers, some of the details, but I've aimed to keep it very simple. I've aimed it at people who don't necessarily look at the numbers in the first place. We're going to determine how you can actually sort of measure your website performance, and just some tips as well on how to actually improve your performance of your website. So the first question is, but why? Why do we need to care about the performance of our website? And the easiest way to sum that up is users are impatient. Akamai did a recent study and covered the Cyber Monday sales. So Cyber Monday are the massive sales they have over in the States, especially tech-wise, where millions of people go and buy things. They have all big inrushes of traffic. So they measured that, the global mobile sort of traffic, and they measured a peak conversion rate of 4.75% was achieved when they had a page load time of 3.3 seconds. A 1 second drop in this page load time actually dropped the conversion rate down to 3.52%, which was a 26% drop in actual sales. And of course, because Google tries to do things for users and wants to present things to users in the best way possible, it's also an SEO ranking factor. So the faster your site is, the more Google knows that users prefer fast websites, so they'll give you some little performance benefit to having a fast website. So we're going to look at some of the numbers and some of the detail. There's sort of 4 key bits that I try to look at for website performance. There is what they call the time to first byte, which we'll go through, the number of requests that are made to your server for the website, the total size of the download, so how big the files and how big the data is. And one that's certainly becoming very popular and more meaningful these days is the time to first meaningful paint, which we'll also go through. So the easiest way to explain time to first byte is your browser, you type in a URL, it makes a request, it has to talk to the server. That time to first byte is the time from when you've hit go to you actually start getting data back from that web server. So it's heavily influenced by your server infrastructure and the code that you're running. So if you're running on really slow systems, that time to first byte will be a lot slower. If you've got loads of plugins, that time will be slower. But it's also a good comparator of network performance in terms of, if you've moved hosting companies, you can actually compare your time to first byte because you're still running that same code on different platforms. The number of requests. So this is how many bits and pieces your website has to load. So every little bit of CSS, JavaScript, all the images, they make requests to and from your web server. So the easiest way to think about it is, think of it like, you've got a shopping list. You need to go and get every item on that shopping list. Your browser is doing the same thing to go and make these requests to the server to get the information back. The total size of the download. When we're looking at how much data you're actually pulling down from a web server, it's how many images, how big the HTML is, how many JavaScript files you have, how much CSS you've got loaded. All of this increases the size of the download. And this becomes really important when you've got mobile users. Even just extended coverage where you've got fringe areas where the mobile performance is much lower. It's very easy to have a nice fibre connection. Hey, my website loads instantly. You get out in the fringe areas where you've got very basic sort of mobile reception, and suddenly lots of downloads and large downloads become a real problem because they won't load very quickly on those devices. And the last one that a lot of people sort of aren't aware of, but becoming a very, I guess, important factor to look at, is the time to first meaningful paint. So you've got a browser that's made all of these requests, it's got all of this information back, it's got JavaScript, it's got CSS, it's got all these HTML and all the bits for your sliders. All that has to combine. So the time to first meaningful paint is a sort of, I guess, a Google term, but the time at which the user feels that the primary content of the page is visible. So this becomes largely dependent on how many things it had to go and download, but also the complexity of the things it had to go and download. Mobile browsers or mobile phones don't have, high-end CPU processors on board. So it takes them a lot longer to process all the information that you've just downloaded before it will actually display something on the screen. So this time to first meaningful paint actually gives us a figure of, when users will actually see something on the screen. So just a thing about some of these numbers and some of these measurements that we have is basically they're meaningless. And the reason I say that is it's perceived performance that matters. Users don't sit there and go, hey, this website loaded in 3 seconds, it's a good website. Users just judge things on the perception of how quick that website loaded. So basically I'm just trying to say, don't get too bogged down in the numbers as we start to sort of look through things. So the perceived performance is how quick a user thinks the actual site is, not necessarily how fast it actually is. And that's, again, back to the time to first meaningful paint. This is when users are seeing things on their screen. So that time can be the important part to sort of judge things by. So as a bit of a quiz around the room, is the WordCamp Port Macquarie website fast or slow? Can I have a raise of hands if they say it was fast?
In Port Macquarie it is, in Nashville it's not.
Who thought the site was slow? Who browsed the site and didn't think either way? And so it just gives an indication of the site was quick enough, so nobody's sort of looked at, they didn't go, hey, this site is terrible sort of thing. I'm not going to continue on it. So it's just an important factor to remember that it's the perceived performance. If it's not a factor that you've actually had to look at, if you didn't have to wait for it to load, you're not thinking, hey, this website is slow. You've just browsed it, viewed the schedule, viewed all the details, and it's sort of, you haven't even subconsciously looked at the speed. But all of these metrics still help. And the reason they help is so that you can see change over time. If you're adding plugins in, if you're changing themes, you've launched a new website, you're upgrading versions of WordPress, or even changing web hosts, you can compare these numbers to get it so that you have a baseline to compare against each time. If you've added WooCommerce, so you've added a store to your site, has the site become much slower? Is it quicker? What's actually going on your website? So in terms of measuring the numbers, there's 3 tools I think are the most valuable in this sort of realm, and the good thing is they're either built into your browser or they're all free. So we've got GT Metrics, which we'll go through. Google Chrome actually has a number of tools built in for you, and Pingdom is another tool that you can use as well. They have a website analysis tool. So GT Metrics, it's basically free for low usage. You get, I think it's 100 requests a month that you can make, and there is actually a server in Sydney that you can make the requests from. So a lot of these testing sites are sort of US or European based. So GT Metrics have a Sydney-based server as well. But a tip there is you need a login to get access to the Sydney server. By default, it will test from Canada. So your website performance figures will actually look a lot worse until you've logged in and set your preference to be Sydney. That's still a free account. You can get away with the free account still to use the Sydney server. So there's still no cost involved there. So for those that thought you know, that the Port Macquarie site was fast or slow. This is what GT Metrics will sort of spit out, and it tries to give, I guess, a score. So a lot of people become fanatical, like SEO tools where Yoast will rank your content sort of thing. You can get caught up in the numbers and looking. If you didn't notice whether it was fast or slow, it's given an F sort of score for the page speed. And we'll sort of go through and see why it's actually given that score. It's sort of told us that it's taken 2.9 seconds to load the page, which is actually quite good. The total size is 5.72 megabytes. So in 2014, the average size of a website was about 1.5 megabytes. It's gone up to 2016, I think the last figure I saw was about 4 megabytes. So pages are getting bigger. So 6 megabytes is probably just slightly above average, but not too bad as well. Google Chrome. You've got tools built into your browser, and I'll show you through those as well. If you didn't know they were there, they're very handy at being able to analyse your site and give you instant information back on what you can look at and what you can improve. And there's both tools that are designed from a developer sort of perspective, but also tools that sort of do an audit of your site from a performance perspective. And this is the score that Google Chrome actually gave via its audit tool of the Port Macquarie WordCamp website. So it's actually given 98 out of 100 for performance. It's given 100, out of 100 for accessibility, 79 out of 100 for best practices, so possibly some improvements there, and 90 out of 100 for SEO. And the last tool you can also use is Pingdom. So Pingdom is an upsite monitoring sort of tool, so you can sign up for an account and it'll analyse your website, tell you when sites are up or down. But they also have a tool built in where you can just once off do analysis of your website and it'll generate a report for you to tell you how your website is performing. So again, it gives a bit of a score. So it's given a C overall, obviously quite a harsh sort of marker, being 75 out of 100 and only getting a C. But again, it's just sort of confirmed the page load size, the page size, the load time of your site, and the number of requests that had to be made to load the site. So let's have a look at some of these tools. So I've run through the performance on GT Metrics of the Port Macquarie website. So we can see it tries to do, just two key scores, the A being the highest score, F obviously being not so good. And the reason it's marked it down is serving scaled images. So you can see in the list, it's given us all the bits that it's gone and analysed, it's given green and given A's. But basically it's telling us, and if we hover over the drop down here, the following images are resized. And by that it means that the resolution of the image uploaded is much higher than what's actually being displayed on the screen. So your browser is actually shrinking that image, meaning you're downloading a bigger file than was actually necessary to display on the screen. It may be hard if I try and zoom in a bit here on the text. You can see their page speed tool has actually told us that if the images were served scaled, i.e. the right resolution, there'd be an 81% reduction in the image sizes, just in that alone. So it's a thing to consider, that where you can optimise the site. It'll also give analysis via Y-Slow, which is another sort of grading tool. So it combines the two, page speed and Y-Slow. It'll start to give what they call a waterfall chart. So this is how your browser's gone about actually downloading the content. So you can see the first request is just for the home page, and if it shows up clear enough on the screen, so it took 11 milliseconds to connect. Then had to negotiate the SSL, which took 210 milliseconds. It's then waited for the data to be sent, which has taken 600 milliseconds in this case, and another second to receive. So the thing with website performance analysis, make sure you run it more than once, because sometimes the figures will vary, and you'll see that between some of the tools that we've used to test the site. The other thing is, if you've logged into the GT metrics, it'll actually keep a history for you. So over time, you'll actually get a build-up. So you can see a few days ago, I ran the test, and it's sort of showing that there's just a slight increase, and it's just showing that there is variance in server performance at times, internet performance, or it could even be their measuring tools that have a slight variance. So it's just being aware that things will vary and these timings will change over time. Through the analysis tools built into Chrome, if you've only used Chrome as a browser and not as an analysis tool, the three little dots that you normally see right up the top, when you're opening a new tab and bits and pieces, if you go down to more tools, and you should be able to see developer tools. And this will open up another panel within your browser, and this is the panel we see over on the right here. It will go through a number of different parts on the site and sort of analysis tools. So the one we've gone to is audits. So I've already run this audit just because I just wanted to make sure I had internet access when I could run the tool and actually give the demonstration. So you can see when I ran the tool a few days ago, because it's actually running the analysis in the browser, my mobile connection that I was tethering my laptop to was slower. So our performance score has actually dropped. And it's just giving an indication of where that variance can also come into effect. So as we scroll down, we see the first sort of content paint and also first meaningful paint. Those figures can be used for analysis of how the website is performing, but the main one you're looking for is the first meaningful paint, is when did the users see the majority of the content there on the screen. If it shows in the little icons that you sort of see midway through the screen here, this is actually giving a pictorial view as the site is loading. So you can see as it's loading information, there's nothing being displayed to the user. So your browser is obviously, downloading that content, and it won't render that until it's got enough information to push to the screen or it's had enough time to process that content. So you can use this analysis to see what your website is looking like on slower connections and as things sort of progressively load. Google will then give you opportunities as where can you actually improve the speed of your website. And you can see it's telling you to reduce server response times. So that time to first byte is a factor of your internet connection and the server. So in this instance, because we had high-speed performance when I was connected to a high-speed internet and everything was fine, but it's slower here, we know that the mobile, performance played a factor in why it took longer to load. But if your target audience is always going to be a regional area or an outlying area or sort of developing nations where the internet isn't up to scratch, you need to consider these things when you're actually building the website for them. It's also sort of giving basic sort of diagnostics of, ensuring that text remains visible during web font loads. So if you've used a different font on your website, but that font won't actually render to the screen until the font has been loaded from like the Google Fonts or TypeScript or one of the third-party providers, then again, the user's waiting before they see something rendered to the screen. And it's, of course, and using the terms, avoid enormous network payloads. So the total size, was over 5 meg that it had to download. And it's also ranked, what was the largest bits on the screen. So you can see, and it is this background image here. That background image alone is 3 megs for the website. So it's actually quite a large, high resolution image that's loaded there into the background. And when you look at the website, of course, it's actually a background image. So it's overlaid with information and majority of it's hidden from sight. So there's certainly some optimizations that could be done there. And it'll go through the accessibility and best practices, sort of letting you know, if there's something that you should be doing that Google considers best practices. But again, just remembering that, you need to understand what it actually means before you try actually go out and make changes. Just to very quickly brush over, so that was the audits sort of tab. There's also the network tab, which sort of will bring you through what it actually loaded within the website. So we can see the main sort of Port Macquarie request. We can see the size, the time to transfer, and again this waterfall display telling us our time to first byte here. Pingdom, and the reason I like running multiple tools rather than one tool is obviously Google is very opinionated in the way it does things. So running GT metrics and also Pingdom just gives you that balance of information. Even though it's hopefully giving you the same numbers, if you're getting variance, then maybe you can put that down to the tool itself rather than your website. So you can see the grade it gave. So it's giving some information to make fewer requests, to compress, some of the components. But the thing I like is the basic breakdown of size by content type. So you can see for the Port Macquarie WordCamp website, 90% of what it was downloading is images. So if you're going, hey, I need to reduce the amount of data that the website is downloading, you know exactly where you need to target first. The amount of CSS downloaded was 1.5% of the entire website. So you're not going to have to spend a lot of time, or if you spend a lot of time optimizing that, then your efforts will be lost very, very quickly. So just to go through and recap, so what can slow a website down? Obviously a slow or poorly optimized server. Network and device limitations will cause speed slowdowns of your site, like we sort of went through. Lots of code and lots of plugins and lots of images will slow down your site. And lots of HTML and JavaScript. So if you've got a site where you've added lots of pieces of the puzzle. So slow servers. If you're on a cheaper hosting provider, basically their job is to pack as many sites onto a server as possible. They're not there to make sure that your website loads in the fastest manner possible. They're just trying to cram them in to make sure they're fit. Network and device limitations. If you're targeting mobile users, this becomes critical because mobile phones are much slower than PCs. Your internet connection becomes very flaky and unreliable. So you need to make sure that you're sort of taking the time to consider their experience. Lots of code and plugins. More plugins, complex plugins. If you've added WooCommerce to your site, it is an enormous plugin. If you require the functionality, that's great. But if you've got lots of plugins loaded on your site, they will all potentially have an impact on the performance of your website. And again, heavy imagery can also slow down your site. Lots of HTML and content. So this is where, especially on mobile devices, where if you've got 6 different slider plugins that have been loaded on your site, each of those have to be loaded in. The JavaScript has to be loaded in by the browser and processed before it can start to display the information to your site, to the screen. So each of these can have a potential adverse effect on how long it takes your browser to load the website. So now that we sort of know the problems, we'll quickly sort of run through the ways that you can actually look at to speed up your website. And the one tip I'll give, and it's I guess an old programmer saying, is that premature optimization is the root of all evil, which basically translates to only fix the things after you know what to fix. There's no point trying to optimize your site before you've actually started measuring and actually know the impact. You could spend enormous times making one little bit. And again, bring it back to the Port Macquarie website. If you spent all of your time optimizing the CSS to reduce the downloads, and it was only 1% of the downloads anyway, you've wasted an enormous amount of effort to fix it. Choose good hosting. Obviously I work for a hosting provider, so I'm biased in that opinion, but good hosting will make your website perform faster. That is simple fact. So it gets you faster servers. The better providers actually focus on optimizing those servers for faster performance. It'll get you HTTP2, which is the newer standard on the way browsers talk to web servers. And it'll get you better connectivity. For example, they'll have high-speed access to, Australian users. So HTTP2, if you're not aware, HTTP is the protocol that browsers use to talk to server and get the information. So the thing about large amounts of requests, All of that goes away essentially with the slowdowns once you start using HTTP2. So all good web hosts have HTTP2 enabled and have done since 2015. And all you need to do to enable that is have an SSL certificate on your website. So instead of individually making a request for each file each time and having to do that request, it will multiplex that request over a single connection. So whereas the Port Macquarie website was 67 items, if that wasn't over HTTPS, that browser would be asking the server 67 times, hey, I need this piece of information. Hey, I need this bit next. Hey, I need this image. HTTP2 goes, we can do this smarter. I know the list of things. Send the whole list, and it sends a whole lot of information back in one hit. Removing unused plugins. Do you really need 80 plugins on your site? Do you need 5 different plugins to load all of the web fonts? Do you need 6 different sliders that you can use on your website? So every time you add a new plugin, there's potential that it will slow things down. Do you actually know what they all do? A lot of people inherit a website. They have their favourite plugins, so they'll install their favourite plugins, but all of the other plugins are still loaded there doing similar things. And so the tip there, especially from a security point of view, is to remove. Don't just disable the plugin. But please take a backup of your site first before you start disabling and turning plugins off. Page caching. If there's one thing that can instantly sort of speed up a website and will help business users, it is to ensure you have page caching. Easiest way to explain it is thinking of baking a cake versus buying a cake. If you bake a cake, you've got to get eggs and flour and milk, combine them all up, mix them, put them in the oven, and wait for it, and then ice it, and there's hours worth of time involved, versus just going to Woolies, grabbing the cake and taking it home. So every time you load a page on WordPress, it has to get the template, it makes requests to the database, has to put all of that together each time you load it. What a page caching system does, it goes, hey, this page hasn't changed, why should I bake and make this each time? So it will store a copy of that after you've done it once. So it reduces your time to first byte, means there's less server overhead and also greater scalability. Because you're not reliant on the server processing time now to render all this information together, you can have a burst of users and your website will be able to handle that burst. A simple plugin to do that is W3 Total Cache, and that's sort of one of the ones we use and recommend. Optimising your images. So you can use plugins to help automate this. As Cameron sort of went through, Smush sort of image optimization, or Smush It, is one of the more popular ones. There are a number of them that you can use that can automatically, with your existing website, you load the plugin. Some of them are paid because they have to use an external server to optimize the images, but they will go in the background and optimize all those images to reduce the size of your website. So for example, the Port Macquarie side of things, it could have looked at some of those images and actually reduced not only the size of them, the size of them automatically, so that there's no work involved to actually optimize. And again, critical for mobile users. And if you're looking more in depth, Kim's actually talking tomorrow on taking a website from 10 seconds to 2 seconds. So she's actually going through a case study on how these optimizations, in a real environment. So just to quickly recap, we want to measure so that we have a good baseline. We need to know the performance levels. But at the same time, we want to look at those numbers and figure out whether they're meaningful or not. And of course, only optimise after you know what to optimise. So I'll open it up to questions.
Yeah, I've got one. Just with the
Hello.
like to say a lot of plugins or an acceptable amount of plugins.
Yeah, so the question being, what is an acceptable amount of plugins, or how many should you have? The hard answer is, it depends.
Yeah.
Some plugins may be, to change the name just within the admin area of one particular thing, so the performance impact of that plugin will be extremely minimal. versus at the other end of the scale, a WooCommerce, where you're loading an entire e-commerce platform into your website, has a very large impact on scale. So there's no, keep it under 20, keep it under 50. It should be, keep it to your essential ones you need to run the website. And as you're making changes, if you've got those figures before and after, you can actually measure the impact of how much that affected the performance of your website.
Just one other question. Just on back. Just on backups as well. You were talking about it's critical when you do make some changes to actually back up all the time. Don't most hosting companies actually back up the website anyway? And if you were to need to recall it, you would actually get that back from the hosting company. That's my understanding.
It would be definitely worth checking with your hosting company. Many of them keep backups for themselves, as sort of Ricky talked about in his talk. So hosting companies, they may only take a backup maybe once a day, maybe once a week. It may be a slow recovery time. For example, our backups are designed to recover an entire server very quickly. If we have to recover a single site off that and there's no external sort of site backup, we have to restore a whole copy of that server to grab that individual site off. The other thing I would say is that keeping your own backup copy means you're in control of that data. So if you need to move hosting companies or your hosting company goes down, if they have a catastrophic failure somewhere, ringing them and hoping that they've got spare time to restore a backup of your site onto a spare server they may have, may not be their highest sort of priority. So if you've got your own backup that you've stored yourself, you can restore it to any hosting provider you want.
And store it off-site. So that
Yes.
store it off-site, so if the server goes down, you've got it not on the server.
So good backup plugins will, Updraft Plus is sort of our sort of favourite. You can store it to Dropbox or Google Drive or Amazon S3, so you can push it to any of these storage platforms that are external to your hosting so that you can gain easy and instant access to it.
You mentioned that HTTPS 2 is kind of made number of requests irrelevant. How true do you think that is? I don't know, but how true do you think it's true?
It's a fair question because it seems too good to be true.
Yeah, it does.
And even Pingdom themselves in the tools, recommend reduce the amount of requests. So there's been a number of companies do performance studies on it, and yes, it does actually make a difference. It is doing one request and sort of bringing that information back.
Yeah, but is it still something to focus on, I guess, is my question, even if HTTP2 is being used, which probably is 99% of the cases these days?
It should be focused, but purely in terms of, do you need 30 different JavaScript, libraries to load on your site? There are other performance impacts. So if you've got a high number of requests, it may be actually, showing that there's another symptom that you need to treat, sort of thing.
So 80-20 basically, do what you can and, go from there. Yeah, cool.
Any more questions?
The HTTP2, is that something you install on the service separately, or is that a result of the SSL?
That's basically a result of the web server platform in place, but basically they've only enabled that protocol and the way it works with the secure connection. So as long as you're with a good hosting company and you've got an SSL loaded on your site, it will actually be in place. So to very quickly show, you can actually see within the Google tools themselves. So if you see, this is brought up the developer tools. So obviously going to the little dots in the corner, going down to more tools, going to developer tools. Yep, that's another way to get a shortcut to sort of view. And within the network area, if you see the protocol in use. So this H2 field here basically represents HTTP2. So you can verify whether it's enabled for your site.
And a second question, is there a plugin that, like if you've got the e-commerce plugin, that only calls that when you've got an e-commerce page on? Or is it always loaded on every page?
So it's always loaded essentially on every page, because the way WordPress and every other platform works is it doesn't know it's not required until it's loaded the template, which is generally one of the last things to run. So where you can still get that performance increase is using the page caching. So page caching will work when users are just browsing the website. So if they're just clicking, looking at bits but haven't actually added anything into their shopping cart, they'll actually be, if you've got page caching enabled, they're browsing the cached copy of that. Because that is the same for every user, once they add something to the shopping cart, it's a little bit of a different story because now that content is unique for that user. It's going to show how many items they've got in their cart and details like that. So that's where some of the other optimisations are then required. But for instance, when there's like the click frenzy, we've hosted a number of sites that have been through the click frenzy sort of sales. You still, like even the Akamai, the conversion rate's still only, under 5%. So you still got 95% of users that are browsing the site. But if they were ruining, your server performance and making it slow for everybody else, then you're not even going to get that, 4% conversion rate through at all.
I've got a really technical question about HTTP2. You know how normally in HTTP it follows the request-response loop, that I request a resource and then it responds. And I've read in HTTP2 that it supports preemptive pushing of content, that the server knows that you're likely, if you're rendering the front page, that you'll also request an image, so it can preemptively send that. Just because the protocol supports that, as a service provider, are you taking advantage of that? And are you inspecting the content as it leaves to know what to push, or?
So we're sort of, I guess, using Nginx out of the box. So it supports some of that, but a lot of the preemptive side, it's not. Most hosting providers aren't using to the full advantage. It's one of those trade-off areas where it can be fiddly to get things right, so there's no easy blanket rule that you can add to, just tick a button to enable.
I think server pushes some headers that you can configure yourself. For server push to fully work, I think you need to actually configure some headers yourself. So that's not something that necessarily comes for free.
Also, as a website owner, you can add that, and then you can take that.
Yes.
Yes.
Any more questions?
Okay, so there were the 4 points that you were talking about at the very start of the speech about the things that we could optimize, and the fourth one was the time to meaningful paint. What optimizations, other than making sure that all of the files that you send are small, the request count's small, and that the server's quick, what can be done to reduce the time to meaningful paint to prevent browser load?
Yeah, so that comes down to the amount of JavaScript loaded on the site, the amount of CSS and the complexity of the CSS. If it needs to load very large style sheets to actually be able to render something to the screen, then that can slow down that time to first sort of meaningful paint. There are, I guess, very complex ways you can get involved and inline some CSS so that the browser knows what to render as a basic sort of thing before you turn on all of the niceties. You can get something written to the screen quickly so that the user starts to see something, and then load the web fonts and the nicer bits in the background sort of thing, so that you're not seeing white screen instantly content.
Awesome. Anyone else?
So one of the metrics that you mentioned initially was the time to first byte, right? If you're serving global customers, most CDNs will obviously just be caching your resources. Apart from, say, a web application firewall or something like Cloudflare, is there any other sort of low-cost option for addressing that time to first byte that you would suggest? I don't know. There's probably not, but
no.
I thought I'd ask.
So the good thing about a CDN is that it won't necessarily sort of store the page, but it will store the rest of the content. So it will reduce the latency to download the images and bits and pieces. How much of a trade-off that becomes just depends on how busy your site is and how much your global influence is sort of required. Obviously, in Australia, we're at a very large disadvantage from an internet connection perspective to the rest of the world. So if 80% of your customer base was in the US, then you'd want to be using a platform that has either replication, across the world so that there are servers in the US, or using a US hosting provider, and therefore the only degradation of performance could potentially be the 20% of customers that are here in Australia. So there's not necessarily a silver bullet. There are hosting providers that have distributed platforms that can take care of that for you. So it's all about, being able to measure and evaluate.
Probably not so much a question, just what I have done with the background image, knowing that they are big, is just edit it and have a white block in the middle so that reduces the overall size of the image.
Yeah. Look, there's always some clever widgets you can incorporate when content isn't going to be placed in the screen. So when it's just going to be hidden most of the time, you could actually do some trickery to sort of cut out the complexities of the image to reduce the size.
On that question of Australian e-com businesses servicing the US market, if you're a big Australian e-com and you're predominantly selling in the US market, would you recommend that the website should be hosted in the US versus being hosted in Australia?
Yes, in that case, if your global market or your majority of your market is in the US, then that's where you potentially want to have your hosting to reduce that time, or using a hosting provider that has a replicated platform where your files are essentially replicated around the world. So there are complexities potentially involved with that. With that as well. So it's all about being able to monitor that and sort of determining where the best factor is there. There's then really clever ways and really techie ways that, the DNS request, they can determine it came from the States, or automatically push you to the right server in bits and pieces as well.
Any more? No, I think that's it. Thank you so much, Tim. That was brilliant.